Hi everyone, my name is Aimee Wall, and this is my novel, We Jane. I first got the idea for this novel when I read about this group of women in Chicago in the late 60s who started what was kind of like a little referral service at first to help people find safe abortions, and they called it Jane. Basically, they spread the word around that if you needed help, you would call Jane, and she could help set you up with somebody safe. But then eventually the service actually evolved to the point where a couple of the women learned how to perform abortions themselves, so they were in control of the whole operation. And I was really fascinated by this story, their focus on control, the fact that they did the work in this way where they worked together but anonymously, the idea of this multitudinous, faceless Jane. Um, and it also just made me think about how few stories we have of people performing abortions in times and places when it was illegal. For obvious reasons, there's not a lot of documented history. Jane is kind of an exception. So we still have this idea of it being mostly back alleys and the occasional sympathetic doctor. But the story of Jane also made me think about how many other people might have been doing this kind of work too, who are just ordinary people quietly doing something that needed to be done. And so I started imagining a group of women in rural Newfoundland who would have been doing this work in the years before the Supreme Court decision in Canada, but who just never stopped. Because despite that decision and despite the opening of clinics across Canada, there would still have been people, there are still people for whom access is so complicated as to be almost impossible. Um, and then that these women, like the Chicago Jane, would want to protect that knowledge and control, and they would want to pass it on to someone. So my novel follows a young woman from Newfoundland named Martha, who's been living in Montreal and is kind of at a loss for what to be doing with herself, but she wants to be a part of something. So she meets this older woman who's also from Newfoundland who tells her about a midwife um, who's still working on the island, kind of in the tradition of Jane. And she convinces her they should go home to Newfoundland together so they can continue this work and so that Martha can inherit the knowledge and protect it. Of course, this doesn't quite play out in such dramatic fashion as Martha has imagined. Um, and she also has to contend with everything that comes along with going home again, in particular, going home again to a place that's changed a lot in recent years. So I'll read a short section from the very beginning of the book. But first, I'd just like to say thank you to my publishers, Jay Millar and Hazel Millar at Book Hug, and also especially thank you to Malcolm Sutton, who edited this novel so thoughtfully and patiently, and also designed this beautiful cover, which I'm so grateful for. So this is the very opening of the book. Jane was driving east. Jane was driving east with a big, vague plan. They were drinking gas station coffee, eating pistachio nuts. They were talking grandiose. We, Jane, they thought. We, Jane, they started a sentence. We, Jane, they spoke manifesto. They, Jane, were still aspiring to the name, one that slips and slides, one from which, the idea was, they would do the work. But the thing was that even then, even by the time they had made it onto the road, Martha was still thinking of her companion as Jane and herself as just herself, always still scrabbling her way into that we, into that Jane, believing that to be distinct from the part of her that just wanted to crawl inside the other woman, into she, Jane. But Jane was not just her, Jane was to be them. Jane, a great, shifting, multitudinous thing. Jane's mantra, we, Jane, are only just getting started. We, Jane, are just a matter of time. This is how they imagined it would go. Is Jane there? Can I speak to Jane? And Jane's back. Jane's a bay girl who's been up in the big world and come home out of it. Jane's got less to lose than ever. Jane had wanted to be a cyborg. She'd wanted to be above the body, but here we are. So, is Jane there? Can I speak to Jane? Jane burning into the parking lot. Jane with a pickup truck and the knowledge and the tools. Jane's number scrawled on the walls of every virtual bathroom stall. The first Jane had packed up shop. Jane's work, it was thought, was done. But really, Jane was always still just lying in wait, coiled, ready, like a fist you don't realize you've made. Thank you for listening. I hope you check out the book.